Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Gutman. I'm president of the University of Pennsylvania and have the privilege of chairing the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. On behalf of myself and my our vice chair, Jim Wagner, the president of Emory University, I'd like to welcome you back to the second day of our 20th meeting. Let me begin by noting the presence of our designated federal official, Bioethics Commission Executive Director Lisa M. Lee. Lisa, welcome. Today we're going to continue our discussion about U.S. engagement in the global response to the current Ebola epidemic, as well as finalize recommendations on neuroscience and related ethical issues. As I explained yesterday at the registration table and in the hands of each one of our commission staff members, we have comment cards, and staff, you want to just hold up the comment cards? There you go. Anyone who wants a comment card, please take one, write down your comment, question, and time permitting, we will read and respond to them. If time doesn't permit, we have a lot to get through, we will get back to you. So thank you in advance for participating in our discussions. Jim, would you like to get us started?
Just to thank everybody for all the hard work and excitement yesterday. I hope we can bring that energy to today's conversations on neuroscience and global health ethics. And ready to go to work.
Okay, so this morning we're going to wrap up our work on neuroscience and related ethical issues. At our last meeting in November, we covered a lot of ground and we settled on some very important and timely recommendations. I want to take the next 30 to 45 minutes or so to summarize where we ended up and discuss a few recommendations that we didn't have a chance to, we deliberated on, but we didn't have a chance to formulate. I want to discuss those more fully with our limited time, and keeping in mind that we've discussed these in depth already. I ask that we focus on substance, not wordsmithing. We can wordsmith these in the time we have, the short time we have between now and getting the report out, but we'll do that. So as you recall, we decided to focus our analysis and recommendation in 3 areas. These areas are both important and they raise controversies that have yet to be fully deliberated and decided upon from a perspective of how they would affect people, and they affect a lot of people. These 3 areas are cognitive enhancement and other neural modifications. We're using the term, as I'll suggest later, cognitive modifications, because enhancements has become a loaded term, but I use it so people understand that it refers to the use of drugs and other things to boost normal people who are thought to have normal cognitive capacity, to boost it even more. That's the thought. And the thought is that that's problematic, but that's what has made this very controversial in part. We are dealing with this in a broader way. Capacity and the consent process is the second, and neuroscience and the legal system is the third. As I say, each of these is important, and each of these is a controversial way in which neuroscience has moved into the public realm. These 3 cauldrons of controversy illustrate the ethical tensions and the societal implications that can arise as neuroscience and technology advance. Our commission is well situated to clear a path for productive discourse on these topics and productive policy making on these topics, clarifying the current landscape of science, identifying ways in which we can come to some agreements on how to move forward, and recommending those ethical paths forward. And ethical, I should say, and scientifically productive paths forward. So let's start with cognitive enhancement, or as we are going to call it more commonly, cognitive modification. To begin, we agreed that it's important to broaden the conversation beyond cognitive enhancement to include a wider array of interventions, technologies, behaviors, and environmental conditions that can impact the functioning of the human brain and nervous system. That is, to broaden it to include this wider array that are pursued in order to modify the functioning of the human brain and nervous system. Within this framing, our discussion coalesced around five recommendations, not modifications, recommendations. First, we recognize that current knowledge suggests the best available scientific knowledge suggests that many non-novel interventions could be safer and more effective at maintaining and improving neural health than some novel neural modifiers. Let me give you some examples. They include getting adequate sleep, getting adequate exercise, getting adequate nutrition, and public health interventions like lead paint abatement. We shouldn't lose sight of these, and it's important to get those out there so people know and rely on the known ways of modifying. Known evidence-based strategies such as these should be implemented and prioritized. In addition to developing new drugs and devices, funders should support additional neuroscience research on these strategies and other social, environmental, and behavioral factors that are associated with maintaining and improving neural function. We should not be biased towards the novel, and good research should test what actually works best in improving brain function. Second, treatments for brain disorders and injuries and mental and behavioral health conditions are valuable and they can be improved. Neuroscience research on interventions to treat neurological disorders should also be prioritized. And we will give examples of what we mean by this, very specific examples. Third, funders should support research to better characterize the benefits and the risks of novel neural modifiers, including drugs and devices. Such research should consider, for instance, the prevalence in educational and professional settings of using certain drugs, the potential risks, the long-term effects, and the real-world effectiveness. Precious little is known about the prevalence of the use, the risks, and the benefits. Fourth, when access to effective beneficial interventions, when we know about effective beneficial interventions, access to these should be equitable and not compound or exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities. Fifth, professional organizations and others should create ethical and clinical guidance about neural modifiers for stakeholders, including physicians, employers, parents, educators, and patients. For example, important example, medical professional organizations can and should develop guidelines for handling requests for prescriptions to augment normal nervous system capabilities. Such guidelines should generally discourage the prescription to children of enhancement interventions that have uncertain benefits and risks. Okay? Now we're going to turn to consent capacity, a topic that raises complex ethical questions because the capacity to consent is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary for interventions that bear risks. So these questions implicate, for example, issues of justice and equitable participant selection in research and the potential for stigmatization and discrimination. We lay out consolidated this to 3 recommendations in this area. First, neuroscientists often conduct research with participants whose consent capacity may be either absent, impaired, fluctuating, or otherwise in question. This occurs in part because many of the conditions that neuroscience research addresses can affect consent capacity. Think of Alzheimer's, dementia. To advance research that seeks to understand and ameliorate these conditions, researchers should responsibly include affected individuals in studies with ethical safeguards in place, and they also should engage stakeholders, members of the affected community, to minimize the stigmatization and discrimination that is real and or perceived. So that's the first. Second, funders should support research to address gaps in our knowledge about impaired consent capacity. There are significant gaps in our knowledge. And this should include clarifying what consent capacity means, and it also should include research to better understand the background conditions that affect decision-making capacity, evaluate current policies and practices, and develop and improve capacity assessment tools. Researchers should publish and widely disseminate the results of such study to inform best practices. Third, state legislatures and federal bodies should establish clear requirements for identifying legally authorized representatives for research participation. As we've discussed before, federal regulations require informed consent from research participants or legally authorized representatives before research can proceed. An important step in conducting ethical research with individuals with impaired consent capacity is determining who can serve as such a representative. Ambiguity here is not good. It really is not workable. So those are the 3 recommendations for capacity to consent. We also formulated 4 recommendations concerning neuroscience in the legal system. First, we've recognized that members of the public, especially ones who serve on juries, would benefit immensely from educational resources that help bring high-level neuroscientific concepts into lay terms. Individuals expected to use and interpret neuroscience, including judges and attorneys, would also benefit from greater availability of basic training that helps bridge the gap between neuroscience and the law. Professional organizations and government bodies should continue to develop training resources and educational tools that explain the application of neuroscience to the legal system. That's recommendation number 1. 2, relevant bodies should undertake and fund comprehensive studies on the use of neuroscience in policy development and legal decision-making. In addition to educational materials, these studies could serve as a resource for judges, policymakers, and the public. Third, to maximize the value that neuroscience has to offer, scientists, the media, members of the media, legal decision makers, among others, must avoid hype. They should avoid overstating or relying too heavily on equivocal neuroscientific evidence to draw conclusions which cannot be drawn from that evidence about behavior, motivations, intentions, and legal inferences. The literature is ripe with such hype. Fourth, neuroscientists should engage with policy development and legal decision-making processes. Academic institutions, professional organizations, and others should encourage researchers to consider the legal and policy applications of their work and train them to engage with legal and policy processes. Fifth and finally, drawing from conversations that informed our report on ethics integration in neuroscience research, that was in our Gray Matters Volume 1, we have one overarching recommendation. Several of the recommendations we've discussed call for additional research on a number of critically important topics. Such research requires adequate support. Funders associated with the BRAIN initiative should provide financial, administrative, and infrastructure support for at least one multidisciplinary center for neuroscience, ethics, and society to address the societal implications of neuroscience research findings and their applications. Such a center would bring together expertise from a diverse set of fields which are needed, including neuroscience, ethics, and policy, and it would be well-positioned to answer open questions, consider neuroscience broader implications, and implement, help to implement policy change. So I suggest we open our discussion with this final recommendation for supporting at least one center that brings together expertise from the several fields that are necessary to understand the interplay between neuroscience, law, ethics, society, and public policy. And so I open it up. And we can just say we're going to develop background. We've discussed virtually all of these, and so I'm not requiring anybody to have extensive discussion here, but I think we ought to make sure we're all on board with these before we move on. Okay? Jim? Okay, John? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So one global comment here, and that is that I think that a lot of the really meaty and substantive and interesting things that are in these various sections don't really appear in these these directives for policy. For example, in the first cluster of issues surrounding cognitive modification, in the report itself, there's some commentary on the ethics of neural or cognitive modification. There's a huge debate about that out there in the literature. A lot of people believe that this is really wrong, immoral, overstretching the bounds of human possibility. Others think it's natural for us to tinker with our capacities in that way. And there's also, I recall, Anita and I went back and forth trying to figure out the best framework for cognitive enhancement. And we struggled with this issue of, how exactly what goes into the framework, and we debated, whether we should have a division, of interventions, for example, those that would bring people up to a normal level or keep them at the normal level, versus those interventions that would give people a slight boost in terms of what humans are able to do now, versus those that are, going to empower people to go way beyond what humans can do now. I think we really need to spend more time on that framework, because I think that if we leave that open, it's going to be extremely confusing to the reader. And it's very interesting and important philosophically. So, but I do think that someplace in here, we might want to find room for a bottom line conclusion about, the substantive ethics of neural or cognitive modification, rather than simply leaving it to various professional societies to come up with guidelines on their own.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah,
Jim?
just, John, what if we step back even one step higher? Do we have a recommendation that is appropriate for us to say, based on all that we've heard and our own backgrounds that we bring to this, to have a finding that says that we assert that in these areas, that pursued in these areas of modification and understanding consent and legal, that we conclude from what we've heard that there are ethical ways to advance in each of these, just as an opening, it has to be phrased well, but just as an opening recommendation, that we've actually studied this, and our foundational pieces, it is ethical to pursue these
Yes.
things under the circumstances that are given in the guidance by our subsequent recommendations. What would you think of that?
Before you should answer, but let me just weigh in on this, because we have deliberated about this. And sometimes I think we ought to be, as, a bit clearer in just in the spirit of what we're recommending in neuroscience and the law. We ought to be a bit clearer in expressing our conclusions. But our conclusion in our deliberations was that there are, just to put just to pursue
Please, yeah.
what Jim has said, our conclusion is there are ethical ways of pursuing the scientific knowledge of improving brain functioning.
And improving and understanding, because that's the
Yes,
consent and legal. Improving-
understanding for the sake of improving
There you go.
brain functioning, and there is the discussion of that is that there is not a bright line between improving brain functioning that is under, normal to improving brain functioning that is normal. And we analogize this to, and we're not saying that so again, corollary, not every way of pursuing brain improvement is ethical. We've suggested
Exactly.
various, caveats. But there is nothing in itself, to put, again, this is the converse, there's nothing in itself wrong about pursuing knowledge to improve the functioning of the brain. Now, there are overly invasive ways of doing this, there are ways of, and so
Yeah.
on. But there was broad consensus on that. And it's helpful to look at the non-neuroscientific ways that human beings have pursued improving brain functioning, education, exercise, sleep, games, things like that. And that is not to cast any kind of, aspersion on previous debates on this, but it's really to say that we do not want, as a commission, to draw a bright line between improving brain functioning of people who are clearly unable to function in the world in a way that's been the norm, such as people who are suffering from dementia, and improving brain functioning as in people who function well but want to have, want to do even better.
Right, well, thanks, yeah.
And there are all
Yeah.
kinds of distributive justice issues about that, but that does not and should not prevent science from exploring these other ways. And there are all kinds of issues of how we want to prioritize funding of this, but that, again, that's a different issue, yes.
I'm not sure we had full consensus on that. Again, I have stated at a previous meeting, would state again, that the sort of argument that the fact of twilight does not mean there's no difference between night and day, and that our failure to draw the line does not imply that there aren't some judgments that can't be made about things that are actually wrong. And I wouldn't want us, because the implication of the sort of way it's phrased is such that it would allow almost anything to be done. And I think we've got to be very clear, if we're going to say we have a consensus, that there
the guidelines.
are ways of pursuing this that are, in fact, can be judged to be morally wrong, and that if we have an overarching
Yes.
statement, it ought to also say that, while saying that, we might not be able to draw that line with any perfect clarity. I'd be
That's
happy
fair.
with that.
That's,
Okay.
I think that's the intent, and we should make sure it's stated that way. Nita Farhani is on the line. We congratulated Nita yesterday for bringing Ella into the world. But now, Nita, would you like to say something on a recommendation or two?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry that I can't be there with all of you, but I've been enjoying participating by watching. I wanted to weigh in first on this conversation, the cognitive enhancement one, to say, or cognitive modification one, to say that I wholeheartedly agree with the approach that we're taking, which is recognizing that the position that we're in providing recommendations, I think, shouldn't be to resolve the debates about what the substantive ethics of cognitive modification are. Rather, I think recognizing that this is a rapidly evolving issue, that there are many different stakeholders and different ways in which cognitive modification may evolve, and recognizing the role that various stakeholders can play in developing ethical guidelines and going forward, I think, is the right guidance and approach. I also agree that there are ethical ways to do this, and that it's important for us to recognize that in the report as well. So to the extent that we are weighing in on the substantive ethics of cognitive modification, it's to say that we don't think that there is any reason to have an outright ban on it, and to also understand that this is part of a continuum, that everything we do is in some form and in some way a cognitive modification. And then I just wanted to underscore how valuable I think it is to frame this as cognitive modification instead of cognitive enhancement. And I wouldn't even necessarily use the word improving, because things like memory alterations that are coming online now, the ability to extinguish certain memories for conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, it's unclear whether one would call that an improvement if you're eliminating or extinguishing certain memories. It certainly improves the life of an individual while it changes and might in some ways diminish the brain. So I think embracing the term cognitive modification advances the conversation and the debate in a meaningful way in this area.
Yeah, and we need to acknowledge that the term cognitive enhancement is out there, and say why we believe it is the better, the more accurate to capture neuroscience, the intent and direction of neuroscience research, the better term is cognitive modification.
I agree. And just including, I think, within that, the idea that brain changes can happen in both directions, and, that this term broadens that debate and conversation.
Yeah. Good. Raju.
So just to maybe respond to John's comment. John, I think you're coming from one end of the spectrum of healthy people in courts and how you might be able to alter, their cognitive abilities. But we could also come at from the other end of the spectrum of people who are ill, such as, dementia or Alzheimer's or something. And certainly, in those instances, for those people suffering from those types of disorders, one would really truly consider that anything that we could do to help them would be desirable. So if you come out from both ends, whether the first examples are the kinds that you talked about, whether you want to make individuals superhuman by enhancing their abilities, whether that could be debated. But the other end, I don't think that there would be much debate about that. So we need to make that clear distinction and say that we're not painting one broad brush across all of them, and that there are clearly areas where this is highly desirable to do.
I agree with that
Yeah.
completely.
That said, there's, I think it's worth adding, there's greater urgency to help people who are not able to function well in society through this research, and it's not a coincidence that that's what President Obama emphasized in kicking off the BRAIN initiative. It's also worth emphasizing, as we do in the recommendations on consent capacity, that not everything you can do to a person who is in a disease state is ethical. So there are ethical guidelines both for cognitive modifications for people who are suffering diseases and cognitive modifications for people who want to improve their brain functioning. There are, issues in both, ethical issues in both cases. So Dan was emphasizing, I agree, I've used the same gray area. Just because there's dusk and dawn doesn't mean there's night and day. There are things that,
Actually, Samuel Johnson, if you want to attribute it, is that.
there we go, it's Samuel, Samuel Johnson was had wise little phrases. But we did agree, I think it's important that we did agree that it is not per se unethical to pursue research that would has the potential for improving brain functioning.
Yeah, right, and I guess, although I think the most interesting parts of all these different chapters are in the guts of the chapters rather than the recommendations, I do agree with Jim's suggestion there, just to say that we, up front, that we have agreed, we have a consensus that this kind of research is ethical to pursue, because, we don't want to get involved in a big dispute with the prior commission. I appreciate that, but people will read this with that commission's very negative judgment about enhancement technologies in mind. So I think that we owe it to our readership, we owe it to ourselves to be clear on those points of disagreement with that prior commission.
While I attempted to focus us on one recommendation, I failed in that, and I'm happy to have failed because this was a very good discussion.
Stephen has
So I
it.
should just say that all the recommendations are open, and if I don't hear any, we've deliberated about all of them, so I will assume that our previous deliberations stand, and but if there's any that you want to enhance, because
Nice touch, yeah.
cognitively enhance
Nicely done.
or modify,
Yeah, tweak. Yeah.
I see Steve, and then Jim.
Thank you. Well, I think especially given John's comments, but our deliberations earlier, if we say in the report that using science to modify brain and nervous system function is on its own not ethically problematic, that is a big deal.
Big deal.
And that could be a,
Subject to the
and
comments.
yes, and because of
But-
that, I agree with John and I agree with Dan,
And-
that we need to be, maybe we need to be more active and explicit
Yeah, yeah.
in the way that we say this, and we need, although in our prior discussions, Raju challenged us to, I think, find the line beyond which one couldn't go. And maybe there isn't a line, but I do think we need to have the caveat that you
Yeah,
raised.
absolutely. I mean, I feel as strongly, and I think it's as intellectually and ethically necessary to say both things. One is that what we've focused on. The other that Dan said, that does not mean that every form of cognitive modification is ethical. There are,
Or every circumstance, it's not
or
just
every
form.
circumstance, and we've put out guidelines that have some relevance here.
Perhaps to help me, I could have some idea from other members of the commission what you mean even by ostension. Point to examples of what you think might be within the bounds of good and what might not be, because that would help me to know whether or not I can actually sign on to this, because there's, to some extent, this is different than what's been said, and I'm not
Yeah.
totally I'm comfortable with it, perhaps with
Okay, I'll
pursuing
get-
some of the research. I mean, obviously, in my view, again, there's a difference between drinking a cup of coffee and putting a brain chip in somebody, a computer chip in somebody's brain, in order to make them, function better than other people. And if we don't think there's a difference between those two, and I certainly think, specifying how we would do that is going to be complicated, and I think we probably would suggest that others have failed in it, and we're not going to, as a commission,
Yeah,
draw that
I'll give you,
line. But
I'll-
tell me what you think would be, within the
give you-
bounds of good, and maybe able to
I'll give
sign
you
on.
I'll give you an example or two which are not in the realm of science fiction. Since we are talking about research on the brain, not just invasive technologies, but research on the brain, it is within the realm of possibility that scientists who do research on the functioning of the brain from very young age will find out that diets that contain heavy amounts of fish oil and other increase brain functioning above what's now normal. And if we introduced more of those elements into the diet from an early age, we would, as a species, on average, function more. It would raise issues about the distribution of that diet, but I see nothing that would be, I see a lot that would be good with that research, and nothing that would, no, moral boundary that would. Similarly, neuroscientists may find out that exercising the brain in various ways increases the circuitry, the connections between neurons early on, and that increases over time. This is directly analogous to seeing how generations have gotten taller over time because of diet and things like that, and the norm has changed. I think those are excellent examples of things that are often not thought about. People think about putting a chip in the brain rather than the other So I think you would agree. I can see you're not.
So it may be helpful then, if we're going to do this, to sort of suggest that these are the examples of the kinds of things that we think would be within the bounds, and that there are others that may be beyond it. And so
Well-
what I don't want to see us suggesting is that, if people want to be able to take, a drug to sort of enhance their capacity, that we think that that's perfectly okay for all humans to engage in. And I think that we've got to be clearer about that if we're going to make this kind of a statement, from my view, and if we want to have full consensus. So.
Dan, I had actually something a little different in mind, going back to the scope of our purpose, which is to advise the brain, B-R-A-I-N, period. And really the thing I had in mind was more focusing on how we advise that mission, okay? And let me just blurt out, and then we can beat it up. It seems to me that there has been consensus that there really is nothing inherently, as Amy said, unethical about pursuing research that helps us understand brain modification, understand what it means to have competency for consent, understand the potential roles in the legal system. I would suggest as a commission we should stay away from specific practices, but rather advising about the ethics of understanding these and giving guidelines that might help folks interpret practices. But it would be impossible, it seems. We keep saying a chip or a drug. For all I know, as we develop the precision with which we can do transcranial magnetic stimulation, there are things I could do against your will. But I don't think we've said anywhere, and I think we should, and in some ways this is counter to our colleagues around the globe that are more precautionary in their principles. But I think we should say that if we believe it, and can say it with consensus, that we don't find anything ethically inherently wrong with understanding all of that at the deepest levels possible.
I think we're repeating, I think we've agreed on that, and I think we've agreed on examples of what would be ethical. And I think we've also agreed that we're open to the idea that we agree that not everything would be ethical in this realm. I don't want to give science fiction-y examples myself and I think so I think we have consensus on that. There may be examples that come down the road that would be very controversial and we wouldn't agree on, but they're not here for us to decide on at this point. And I think what we've just said and what we've deliberated in the past would be very helpful to say. Partly it would be, and let me just put I think it would be helpful to say, in no small part, because we would be practicing what we're preaching against hype.
Fine. So if I'm hearing this, then it's limited to a recommendation that we would support research, which would be directed towards understanding how to improve the capacity of human brain function beyond its current range of normality, recognizing that not everything will be, in fact, morally permissible, that there will be some things that could be, in fact, judged to be wrong, but some examples of the kinds of things that we would consider to be morally permissible might include early dietary manipulations of young children, or various kinds of cognitive stimulation that might enhance the general capacity of human beings, if in fact equitably applied to all developing young human beings. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think I would be able to say I could agree with, but I'm not sure how far beyond that. And if you want consensus, that's as far as I probably am willing to go. So.
Seems I don't think we've gone any further than that in our deliberations. And again, subject to saying it in a very clear way. Steve?
Although we agreed that we would title this area cognitive enhancement, we've peppered, I think, our discussion with other areas of enhancement. So I think when we write the report, if whenever appropriate, we can use neuro enhancement, including cognitive enhancement, that
Good.
would be useful. Many of the near-term drug and I think game and teaching opportunities to modify function have focused on broadly frailty, and we may well see muscle, or balance
Yeah.
things quite early.
Yeah, agreed. Nita, would you like to comment on law and legal recs?
I would, but I want to add just one comment here on the cognitive enhancement, which is two different issues that I hear. One is I'm not sure that the method of modification is something that I would want us to cite as potentially problematic. So some of the things that Dan says, like taking a pill or brain implants, for me, it isn't so much about the method as potentially the context in which the enhancement occurs.
Yeah.
So just like in sports, we might decide that certain types of modification are impermissible. In other competitive settings.
We're agreeing
Great.
with you, Nita.
Great.
I mean,
Great.
we did not mean to, in giving those examples, we did not mean to suggest that it's
Great.
the method.
Great.
Yes, go ahead.
Great. And the second is, Dan also said that there will be some things that would be judged to be wrong. I wouldn't be comfortable with us going that strongly. I think it's possible that there are certain contexts in which modification we could set the rules to say it would be impermissible, but as a per se matter, I don't think I would feel comfortable saying that there are things that we will judge to be ethically impermissible for cognitive or neuro modifications.
Let's just stop there. I think that's correct as well, because we don't know, so we will, that's why I said subject to wording this in a way that captures the intent here, okay?
Great. I wanted to comment on what you had opened with, which is the multi-center approach to setting something up. I agree with that there should be something. The way that we've stated it right now doesn't recognize or identify at kind of what level we think that should be. And one conversation that we've had in the past, and that we've had a number of speakers come in to speak with us about, is some of the successes or limitations of the NHGRI approach, the ELSI approach. Yeah, and I think it would be useful for us to have some perspective on what it is we're calling for. Are we calling for something that is private institutions? Are we calling for something that is more like the ELSI setup? And what might some of the concerns or limitations or differences be in how we think that should be set up here to be more successful in this context and to address some of the previous concerns that arose from the ELSI setup?
Yeah, and we heard, not surprisingly, conflicting views. We had people who were extremely enthusiastic about replicating ELSI and people who were equally critical about it. And the question I have for the commission members is, we have agreement that it's a good thing to fund centers that bring together neuroscientists, experts in ethics, experts in law, experts in other relevant areas. Do we agree that what we want to recommend is multiple? Do we want to recommend? Let me read what the recommendation, as it's now worded. Okay, if I can find it. What page? Do you have it? I'll just.
Is that it? A center? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So such a center, do we want to recommend a center or more than one center? Is there one center that we want? I have, okay, so Nelson, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think my recommendation would be to probably get away from the brick and mortar concept of a center, because so many of us now operate in virtual laboratories, virtual consortia, that just in terms of funding are usually centered at one brick and mortar, but involve many others. So, I mean, in my own field, there are large consortium funded by NIH to do vaccine development for HIV, and they may involve up to 10 different universities. So,
Can someone on staff just give me I have so many pages here, the recommendation, just for the center?
I would just make the recommendation,
So
I
I
think,
can read it.
flexible for that kind of arrangement, which is pretty typical, and I think would probably provide the most responsiveness to the initiative.
Okay. Okay, here we go. I have it here. Several such a center, funders associated with the BRAIN initiative should I have it, so should provide financial, administrative, and infrastructure support for at least one multidisciplinary center for neuroscience, ethics, and society to address the societal implications of neuroscience research findings and their applications. Such a center would bring together expertise from a diverse set of fields, and that we're agreed on. Yeah,
At least one.
yeah. Christine?
I think the idea is good. I think the main thrust of that recommendation is that BRAIN Initiative researchers, or the funds that are available for BRAIN Initiative should be used for multidisciplinary input, whether it's a center or something else, some kind of way to bring together multidisciplinary perspectives, but it needs funding. And so the funding should come from the BRAIN Initiative. I think that's the thrust of that. And whether or not we say center some people may read that as Nelson said, as suggesting one place, one building, one,
Well, it
and I
doesn't-
don't know if that's what we want. I don't care
No,
about
but it
that.
has to be a multidisciplinary enterprises that bring together in an ongoing way to do research. And ideally, to do research and teaching in this area as well. So, okay, so it's not one. We're not asking for one ELSI. We're asking for, I'll give the rationale after I say it. We're asking for that in order to be effective in moving neuroscience research and teaching forward, there needs to be funding for multidisciplinary programs and activities that are directed at the important issues, the emerging issues in neuroscience.
I think that's
Okay.
important because center has a particular meaning in the funder world.
It has many, yeah. Steve, did you want to add, Dan?
Yeah, I think that what you're trying to do with this is to sort of continue the idea of having the multidisciplinary research, but recognize the criticisms that we heard from some of the speakers about ELSI and its being sort of subject to politics and the sort of concerns of investigators inside the NIH. So I like the idea actually of taking it outside toward universities. I don't want to leave it as vague as sort of saying funds will be available because then it I think can be more easily ignored. So if we want something like centers, then it could be something that would be more like big data centers that are being funded. That it would be like clinical translational research, grants that are given to competitively to a particular number of centers that would do this, and that funds be made available for something like that. I think that might be a wise way to sort of go forward, because it doesn't make it absolutely captive to the people who are doing the research and could in fact be a way to get beyond some of the difficulties that we heard about from the ELSI project and free up the investigation from an ethical and policy perspective. And that's the way I would think about
Can
it.
I just say something about that?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, though, ELSI is not at the NIH. It's funding for people at universities to do research. That's what it is. So,
But it sort of comes out of. I mean, the direction of it is coming.
some of it is investigator initiated. I mean, it's NIH funding, but it goes
It's
to.
NIH funding.
Funding,
And that's what we do want to call, there is a concern that was expressed over and over again that it's really our job to make sure we say very clearly, and the concern is, it was said most recently in another context by Bill Nye yesterday, but if neuroscience is to go forward with an integrated approach with ethics, law, and policy, there must be funding from the beginning for these interdisciplinary approaches. And we have seen from the beginning, the BRAIN Initiative wanted to say and said very front and center how important ethics is to it. And then there were some initiatives with funding where ethics was nowhere to be found, and people who had expertise in it were nowhere to be found. And that's been repaired in part because of our urging, and I think it's just really important for the future of this initiative to have adequate funding for these kinds of multidisciplinary approaches. Roger?
So, I mean, in Gray Matters Volume 1, one of the first recommendations that we made is that, all brain-related research must incorporate, ethics. And we sort of felt that kind of a distributive model is the best way to be able to disseminate and incorporate ethics into thinking about science. So in regard to, this recommendation, we should be consistent with that, and I like your second formulation of that, and to be able to not a single element, but to be able to say that, the principles that we articulated are important, and that goal can be accomplished, in a distributive way.
Yeah, so we're going to make it there'll be the intent is to fund multiple places. At the same time, we know, and we're not saying that every bit of research that goes on, I mean, there is some research that goes on that's very specialized that would not benefit from this, but there has to be significant funding for this for it to happen. And I think we ought to say that very, very clearly. That without funding, this is not going to happen. Okay, anything else? And
Yeah.
we have, we're actually at our time for this, but I'll take.
Let me make two very quick comments. One jumps right off of this, and I've made this comment before, and maybe this is just lightweight stuff, but I think to the degree that we read through each of our recommendations as though they are only piece that's going to be read, two things come to mind. One is specificity, and being specific like this about funding, being specific about which agency we anticipate having responsibility. I would like to urge that get written into every of our recommendations, but this conversation prompts that thought. The second is goes back to something that John has said a couple of times, and he said it again early this morning, that so much of the meat and so much of the intent is in the text before these, that we ought to make sure, again, that if you read them alone, we haven't lost something. And I'm thinking specifically about the ethics content. I'm not sure that when I read a recommendation says that we recognize that several lifestyles and public health interventions could be safer and more effective. I think that's a nice public health statement, but we're an ethics commission. And I think somewhere in that we ought to very briefly identify why there's an ethical consideration of that and what we're pushing ethically. Otherwise, I fear that even those who are going to be that those who pick up a report and spend time only on the recommendations may not fully understand what our contribution has been and how we expect specifically for them to be carried out. So those are two thoughts, okay? If you look for ethics content in each recommendation and look for specificity in each recommendation.
Without, but could I just say, and this is a friendly amendment, without just putting the word ethics over and
No,
over? I mean,
right.
there are, right, I mean,
Thank you.
don't need to
Thank
say
you.
ethics for something to be clearly,
But I'm just saying,
Ethic.
right, I just
Ethic.
don't think we've untangled any ethical dilemma
Let me
if you
just-
simply.
can I just see which
See that.
one we're
For
talking
example,
about?
here, we recognize that several lifestyle interventions, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are others like that. And while it's actually a great statement and it's true,
Yeah,
it's more of a public health statement than it is a ethics commission statement. Thank you.